Welcome to this first module for the Requirements Writing course. In the introductory module, we begin by revising the characteristics of the requirement statement that we're writing, both as individual requirements and then as a set of requirements. We then outline the rules for writing good requirements, which come from an authoritative source, the Guide for Writing Requirements developed by the Requirements Working Group in the International Council on Systems Engineering, INCOSE. Now, the INCOSE Guide provides some 40 rules for writing good textual requirements, and each rule is written so that it can be implemented independently in an automated tool set. Consequently, they're a little difficult for humans to follow in isolation, so in this course we combine the rules into logical groupings to ease discussion. Then, having outlined the characteristics we're looking for, and the rules by which those characteristics can be achieved, we begin this module to work through those rules, illustrating as we go with examples. In the following presentations, we consider the writing of text-based requirement statements. Now, when writing formal, contractually binding statements, natural language doesn't serve us very well because it can be very hard to be clear and precise and to avoid ambiguity when using common English words and common sentences. However, if we're careful to avoid ambiguity, textual requirements are very powerful because there's no limitation to the concepts that can be expressed. So we need to consider what must be done when we write requirement statements so that we can avoid ambiguity. Desirably, to be useful, each requirement statement should exhibit all of the following characteristics. First, it should be necessary. The requirement must be necessary in that the system could not function in the desired way without this requirement. It also follows that a requirement can't be necessary if it can't be traced back to a higher level requirement and to the associated need. Then, the requirement must be appropriate. That is, the specific intent and the detail contained in each requirement should be appropriate to the level to which it refers. Appropriate to level also normally means that each requirement must be independent of the method of implementation, or the process, or the physical solution. That is to say, it should say what rather than how. Next, the requirement should be unambiguous, and this is really important and we'll talk a lot more about it later. All readers of the requirement should come to the same understanding of what the requirement is saying. That is, there can only be one interpretation. Now, this is very difficult, particularly in English, where one statement can have more than one meaning. When we discuss later how to write good requirements, most of the rules we'll describe are actually focused on this aspect, reducing ambiguity. Then, the requirement should be complete. That is, it must be able to stand alone. The requirement must therefore be sufficiently descriptive of that aspect which is necessary to meet the entity's need without requiring any other information to understand the requirement. The requirement must be singular. That is, it can't be a combination of two or more requirements. The requirement set has to be normalised, therefore, so that requirements don't overlap. This also implies that the requirement is concise and clear. A requirement must be feasible. That is, it must be achievable using extant technologies and manufacturing processes. To be feasible, the requirement must be able to be met with acceptable risk within such constraints as cost, schedule, technical, legal, ethical, regulatory, and safety. The requirement must also be verifiable in that it can be proved that the system meets or possesses the requirement. Verification may be by one or more means. It's axiomatic that the requirement must be correct, but what we mean is that we check to see that it is correct as part of our assessment of the requirement, because an incorrect requirement will result in a system that doesn't meet what the users really require. And finally, the requirement must be conforming. That is, it must conform to an appropriate standard, pattern and style, and a style glossary set by the organisation. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about requirements writing. In addition to the characteristics of individual requirements, the set of requirements should also exhibit a number of characteristics. First, they should be complete. That is, the set must stand alone. It should not need any other description to support it. It should therefore contain all the necessary capabilities, constraints, interfaces, and any other aspect necessary to meet the needs of the entity being described. It must be consistent. That is, that the requirements in the set are unique. They don't conflict with other requirements and they don't overlap with other requirements. Then the set, of course, must be feasible. We saw that a requirement must be feasible, but so too must the set. Individual requirements can be feasible, but the combination of those feasible requirements could actually not be feasible as a set. And so feasibility is also a characteristic of the requirement set. The set must also be able to be validated. We must be able to prove that the set of requirements achieves the entity's needs, of course, again within the acceptable constraints. Now, as a guide to achieving these characteristics, both individual and as a set, the NCOSE Guide for Requirements provides some 40 rules for writing good textual requirements. Each of those rules is written so that it can be implemented independently in an automated toolset, so they're a little difficult to follow in isolation. Here we group them into logical sets for ease of discussion, but we note in parentheses which of the NCOSE rules relate to each group. For example, R1 relates to Rule 1. If you'd like to examine each of the rules in more detail, I suggest that you obtain a copy of the guide from the NCOSE website. It really is a very useful resource. Writing well-formed requirements can be achieved by using the following guidelines. You'll note that most are focused on the clarity and precision required to help avoid ambiguity. First, use a style guide. Then use a standard template for a single sentence, defining terms in a glossary, using correct English expression. The subject of the sentence needs to be appropriate to the level of the requirement. If we're going to describe a number of requirements, we should use lists explicitly. We should use the active rather than the passive voice. We should use the definite article rather than the indefinite article. We should always use the same term to mean the same thing. We should avoid vague words, superfluous words. We should avoid unbounded statements. We should avoid using escape clauses and using conjunctions. We should ensure that if we do need to combine things, that we use some logical construct for those conditions. We should avoid unnecessary precision, that is, being too precise when unnecessary. We should be precise, though, when necessary. We should ensure that we always use ranges, tolerances, and appropriate units for each requirement. We should avoid the use of the word not. We should avoid cross-reference to other requirements. We should avoid the use of pronouns, which are effectively cross-referenced to nouns. We should use diagrams wherever appropriate. We should introduce logical groups of requirements with informative statements. And we should ensure that each requirement is verifiable. Now that seems like a long list. Each, though, is actually quite obvious in its own right. So let's look at those in a little bit more detail one by one. So first, the use of a style guide. A style guide essentially sets the context within which all other good requirement writing practices can take effect. A project-wide style guide for both individual requirement statements as well as sets of requirements should include a definition of the structure of requirement statements. We'll see what this structure is shortly. It should define the structure of requirement sets, such as the grouping of related requirements into logical groups, and it should also define the attributes to be used and to be appended to each of the requirement statements. Now, probably the most important of these definitions is that of the requirement statement, at which most requirement writing rules are aimed. The first rule regarding statement structure is that the statement must be a single sentence. Now, that assists with the desired characteristic of singularity. That is, a requirement cannot be a combination of two or more requirements. The urge to write two sentences in English is normally driven by two separate, or at least two loosely coupled thoughts, which probably relate to two separate, or at least two loosely coupled entities. So if we express the requirements in a single sentence, we can be more sure that we're describing a single entity. The discipline of limiting the requirement to a single sentence is also important because the inability to express the requirement in a single sentence tends to lead to ambiguity. That is, the longer the description, the less likely it is to be succinct and the less likely it is to be interpreted the same way by everyone. For similar reasons, as we'll discuss later, conjunctions should not be used in the requirement statement to join clauses. We can't say that the entity shall A and B because that's two requirements. Now, it's sometimes necessary to use conjunctions to connect adjectives and adjectival phrases, but we ought to avoid them in connecting phrases and connecting clauses. As well as being contained in a single sentence, The requirement statement should be as short as possible because any convoluted concepts in the statement will invariably translate into ambiguity. The next aspect that we must define is the structure of that simple sentence that forms the requirement statement. We start with the structure of a traditional simple English sentence: subject, priority, verb, object. Now the elements of that most basic form then are, well, the subject, that's the thing that's being specified. In a system level specification, the subject is invariably the system. In a lower level specification, the subject would be a subsystem, a component, or an actor in the system. The priority is normally shall. Should or may could be used to identify requirements that are not mandatory, but it's better practice to always use shall and to use the priority attribute of the requirement to identify the level of priority. Will is not to be used in a contractual document. The verb is the action to be undertaken by the subject of the requirement. The object is the entity that's being acted upon by the subject. So an example of this basic form of standard structure might be: the system shall display the time. We'll see shortly why system and time have capitalised first letters. Now that simple structure suits us for many types of requirements. In some cases, however, the subject only acts under certain conditions. That is, we might say condition, subject, priority, verb, object. For example, in our previous example, the system is not expected to display the time when it's not turned on. So we might say, when in the on state, comma, the system shall display the time. Now it may also be necessary to provide some qualification to the action. In that case, we use the structure condition, subject, priority, verb, object, qualification. To continue our example, we may wish that the time is displayed in such a way as to avoid obscuring any work that might be on the workspace. So we might say, when in the on state, the system shall display the time without obscuring the workspace. Again, notice the capitalisation of workspace with an underscore combining the two words into a defined term. We saw that before with both system and time. The capitalisation and the underscore show that the term has been defined in the project glossary, which is a very important design tool. The glossary is essential because the English language has several 100,000 words with very similar but subtly different meanings for different words. However, this richness is a downside when we're seeking to avoid ambiguity in legally binding requirement statements. In a requirement set, we cannot allow there to be any doubt as to what is referred to by the use of a single word. It's very important that each word, therefore, must be made explicit. And a glossary is the way in which we do that, the way in which we define the words and then use them precisely. Glossary terms are capitalised throughout the requirement set to signify that the word or term being used has a specific meaning in the context of the set. It's also useful to inform the reader of this convention at the beginning of the specification so that they're aware what it means when they see the capitalised word. Now, as a slightly trivial but interesting example of the ambiguity of common English, here's an example of why we would need a glossary. There are actually a surprisingly large number of meanings that can come from even a simple sentence. Here's the common English sentence, Mary had a little lamb. Now here are all the meanings of Mary, including a person with that name, a girl with that name, a woman of that name, a perfect female, and more. The English verb to have has a number of meanings. It could mean owned, contained, experienced, subjected to, engaged, permitted, married, tricked, gave birth to, and so on. Little can have a number of meanings, including small, young, short, unimportant, paltry, contemptible. And finally, lamb can mean a number of things, including a young sheep, a form of food, a dear person, or a member of a church flock, and others. So in combination then, there are a very large number of potential meanings of that very simple sentence. So for example, it could mean that the writer intends to say that a woman named Mary tricked a contemptible member of the church flock. With so many potential combinations, we really can't allow so many meanings to exist. Consequently, the precise meaning of each term must be included in the glossary to avoid that ambiguity, not only of the word, but of the combinations of words. Now, as an aside, while we're here, in English law, we're aided by the principles of common law, including the reasonable person test. Because of the prevalence of the nursery rhyme in English culture, a reasonable person from that culture would assume that what the writer really meant was that a girl named Mary owned a small young sheep. But we can't rely on that common law. We'd rather be very careful in the way in which we phrase the sentence. So what does that mean for requirement statements then? Well, to extend our example before, that is the system shall display the time, that's ambiguous if we don't put the capital T on time because it's not obvious what time zone is being referred to, what resolution the time must be displayed in what format, and many more. It's unwieldy then to add all of those qualifications. We could actually write those qualifications at the end of the sentence by the structure we showed before, but it'd be very unwieldy to do so, and we'd have such a long sentence it'd become unclear. And so the better thing to do is simply to pause, define time with a capital T in the glossary, and then rewrite the statement to say the system shall display the time with a capital T. Anyone who wants to know then what time really means in the context of this requirement set simply has to look up the glossary. Of course, there may be more than one time being referred to in a requirement set, such as the current time, the local time, or the arrival time. When more than one term is defined containing a number of words, it's often useful to use an underscore to signify that the definition is of a term, not of two adjacent words. That is, for example, the system shall display the current underscore time signifies that current underscore time is a glossary item, whereas the system shall display the current time may imply, inappropriately, that current and time are two separate glossary items. The glossary is also a useful place to define acronyms and abbreviations, which then must be used consistently throughout the requirement set. As with other glossary items, the use of different acronyms and abbreviations for the same entity implies that the two entities being referred to are actually different, which then leads to ambiguity. Just as in normal written English, the use of incorrect grammar, spelling and punctuation leads to ambiguity, text-based requirements must therefore be written using correct English expression so as to ensure clarity in understanding. So, for example, as a simple example, the weapon system shall store the location of each ordnance is unacceptable because it contains misspelling of ordnance, which leads to ambiguity. And that is, it needs to be rewritten so that ordnance is spelt correctly. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the first module. In this course, we're considering the writing of text-based requirement statements. So it's important to have started by addressing which aspects we're looking for in a good requirement statement, and then in a good set of requirements. We call those aspects the characteristics. So we looked at the characteristics of a good requirement statement and the characteristic of a good set. We then summarised the rules that should be followed in order to write good requirements, and we saw there is much to be done when developing those requirement statements so that we can avoid ambiguity. We saw that we must follow a number of rules if we're to develop useful requirements, and we started to work through those rules, beginning with the structure, the syntax, of the requirement statement. I suggest that you now complete the quiz for the module in preparation for the test. Don't forget, the test questions come from the same set of questions as the quizzes, or at least the questions are very similar in their nature and depth. So repeating the quizzes is the best preparation for the test.